Not present. That's it. So today we're going to be talking about everyday life in the 1790s in the LOCHALSH parish, which is a parish on the west coast of Scotland and very important to McLennans generally.
The West Coast.
If you could turn your microphones off, mute your microphones, that'd be good, all of you. I'll just do that again for the sake of the Kathy, Diane, you've got to get off, and I've got to mute you. I'll mute you if you don't. I won't mute you, Kathy, that's for sure. Okay, I hope I've got everybody. So let's start again. So today we're talking about everyday life in the 1790s in the parish of LOCHALSH. This west coast parish is very important to McLennans. There are quite a lot of McLennans live there, and it's an interesting parish. And I think one of the things we're learning, looking at all these individual parishes, is how different they are one from another. And we're learning different aspects of even things that are the same because of the different ministers and the different way of researching and finding out what was going on there. We've presented these very successfully to two other people, and we're very grateful to Kathy for her research in this topic and also for offering to do the presenting of most of the session today. Kathy has ancestors from LOCHALSH, and so she has a personal interest in this parish. She's been helped greatly by Catherine, who has also got a lot of knowledge of this area, and Catherine is here to be a bit of support for the team. Thank you, Catherine. So I'll hand over to you, Kathy, now. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today we're going to be talking about LOCHALSH Parish, using the old statistical account, FASTI, maps, other books and articles either written about LOCHALSH or the Western Highlands in total, to better understand everyday life in the parish in the 1790s. Some of the topics we're going to be touching on are the location, the topography, soil, climate, some of the wild animals that can be found there, the crops, livestock and produce, the population, the occupations they had and tasks that they completed, morals, the poor, housing, fuel, transportation, health and diet, a little on education and language, the minister, the state of the church, the heriter or laird, his background, and the clan Mackenzie, McLennans in and from LOCHALSH Parish, and finally a few curiosities to be found there. Before I begin, I just wanted to mention that in reviewing the information, it exposed other gaps that we have in knowing what the everyday life was like. And it also exposed some contradictions by the writers and their opinions of those details. So with all that being said, I wanted to quote something that Kenneth Neal McLennan Campbell said right before he did his Harris presentation. And he said, quote, "The data given in this presentation are the quote unquote truths as selected by us, but not necessarily the real truth, as no mortal can ever present the real truth." And I also wanted to apologize ahead of time if I mispronounce names or terms. I've been trying, and I've gotten some really good helpful hints from folks on a couple of the other calls on how to pronounce some things. The old statistical account for the parish was written in 1794 by Reverend Alexander Downey, and he was relatively new to this parish at the time he was tasked to write this. The parish of LOCHALSH is in the county of Ross, in the presbytery of Loch Carron, and in the synod of Glen Elg. And as you guys might remember, presbytery is just a name for a district of Presbyterian churches, and synod is just the assembly of those clergymen. One thing to note is that this statistical account was somewhat lean in that it was only about 8 pages. And you can contrast that with the Harris statistical account, which was full of information. It was about 50 pages long. So it just shows that the ministers had real leeway and discretion in what they reported on. This is a map of the location of LOCHALSH, and it's in the Highlands, of course. It's on the northwestern coast. It is part of Ross and Cromarty. The Ross and Cromarty parishes are noted in green. LOCHALSH is down here in the yellow. It's surrounded, bordered by 4 other parishes: Loch Carron to the north, to the west, Portree or the Isle of Skye, to the south, it's Kintail, and to the east, it's Uri. The inhabited part of the parish is here, and this is a peninsula. You can't tell right now from this map, but there is a loch right here, and so it is surrounded on 3 sides by water. Reverend Downey notes that the name of the parish, LOCHALSH, and the names of most of the farms and villages are of Danish and Norse origin. This is the old statistical account map, and again, it's just highlighting that peninsula part, the western part of the parish. He noted that, and you can see on this map, that the farms and the villages on the peninsula, you know, they hug the coastline, you know, all around here. And that makes sense because that's where the arable farmland is. It's their farms and villages such as Ardelve and Ardhill, Auchtyre, Balmacara, Craig, Durinish, Kirkton, Nosti, Plockton, also known as Plock or Omplock, Salachi, and Stromferry. You can see the 4 lochs. Here's Loch Carron, LOCHALSH down here, Loch Duich here, and this is Loch Long, this piece in here. It's to note a couple of things. Plockton and Kyle of LOCHALSH, which is on the point here, were very sparsely inhabited, weren't anything to talk about at the time of this account, and didn't grow in population and importance until, you know, later on. Specifically, Plockton, or Omplock as it was called, which is Gaelic for pimple or bump, and it just describes how it sticks out a bump into the loch. It didn't start to grow until about 1814, at the same time that Jeantown up in Loch Carron parish was growing, and the new heriter for LOCHALSH, his name was Sir Hugh Innes. He started a planned fishing community in Plockton so that the folks could earn a living fishing and kelping, because he was starting to move them off small farms. And so that began the growth there. Plockton's real heyday was like 1850 to 1880, you know, at the height of the herring industry. A fun fact, there's a BBC 1990s era BBC police drama series called Hamish Macbeth, and they filmed it on location in Plockton and Kyle of LOCHALSH. Kyle of LOCHALSH, it began to grow and have more people inhabit the area in 1819, when the Inverness Road was completed and came down into Loch Carron here, and the ferry, you know, it increased the ferry traffic here, and then in turn the Kyle became the ferry station for the Isle of Skye. And then when the Highland train finally made its way in 1897, about, it also became then the ferry station and transportation hub to Stornoway, Isle of Lewis. The blue pins that you see, the first one is the only church that was in the parish at this time. It was the LOCHALSH Parish Church at Kirkton. this became kind of the hub, the center of what was going on in this inhabited area. The other two pins are churches that were important to the people in Lochs. The first one here is a Catholic church, St. Duthic, I believe, was established in 1701 in Dorney, which is in Kintail Parish. And then this third pin is the Kintail Parish Church, and it in 1719 was damaged in attacks by the Hanoverians at the same time that Ely and Donan Castle was up here. And it sustained damage, but they still had services through 1855. And then it kind of was abandoned and laid to ruin. But there's a very important graveyard next to it called Clachon Duick Graveyard, I believe. And there's McLennans and McRae's and Mackenzie's buried there. It's near Morvich. That's about all there. This is a Google Earth map. Again, basically just the peninsula, the western part of this parish. It highlights the terrain, which is typical of Western Highlands parishes, in that you can see that it's hilly and mountainous, all the way across. You can see the green areas, which are those farmlands and pasture lands following the coastline around, the river openings around the sides of the lochs. Reverend Downey in his account goes on to say that the terrain here produces an excellent soil for pasture because of the hills, and they create valleys and hollows that make an excellent soil. The next slide, whoops, nope, I'll go back, I forgot. Also, he goes on to talk about the climate. And the climate here is, again, very typical of the Western Highlands, in that it's cold and it's rainy and it's wet and it's windy. And when we compare it to Uri Parish that we talked about a couple weeks ago, they're very different in terms of the inhabited parts of Uri Parish and Lochs Parish. And one good comparison is in like the annual rainfall and how many days a year that it rains. And so, for instance, Lochs has an annual rainfall of about 85 inches a year, and it rains 215 days. And in comparison, Uri has about 38 inches of rain a year, and it rains about 158 days a year. So you can really see that. And we heard that Uri Parish was a little bit more successful agriculturally than Lochs. And I think it's due to less rain. So the storms, they come in from the Atlantic, the mountains in Skye, mountains in Lochs, the mountains in the surrounding parishes. They kind of keep the rain and the cloud cover there and just over this area, and they don't have a chance to move eastward to the Eastern Highlands. Dr. Samuel Johnson, he traveled extensively through the Highlands in 1773. He made an interesting comment about the Highlands' severe winters and their wet climate. And he said, quote, "Scotland is a vile country, though God made it, but we must remember that he made it for Scotsmen, and comparisons are odious, but God also made hell." So, in thinking about this climate, I mean, it was almost constantly rainy, they were wet, and cold. And so you just have to think that it just made life, everyday life, really difficult for folks, from basic things like just keeping yourselves warm. to successful agriculture and to transportation and getting around and moving from parish to parish or even village to village. So I just thought that really highlighted that. Reverend Downey must have been taken by the fact that there was so much wildlife in the parish. He went on to share that in the high hills there was red deer and mountain hares and this particular type of bird called, I believe, a ptarmigan. And in the lower hills, you know, smaller deer, foxes, all kinds of eagles, all kinds of hawks, rodents, you know, all that kind of thing. Lots and lots of migratory birds, lots of seabirds, ducks, swans, geese, terns, and, you know, an abundant fishing area. And also, you know, the lochs were visited by otters and porpoises and seals and whatnot. He does make mention that, you know, these animals, some of these animals didn't make their way into the people's diets because the animals were owned by the heriter or laird, and you didn't partake without an invitation. Sporting estates didn't become a thing really until about the 1850s for the stalking of like red deer. But it quickly grew for the wealthy. And by the end of the 19th century, there were 150 deer forests, and it was like 2.5 million acres were devoted to these sporting estates. So I guess it's a way to use the land and an industry. These are a couple vistas of villages on the northern coastline of the peninsula, Plockton, you know, looking out over Loch Carron. And this is the outskirts of Storm Ferry, also from looking from the loch. Just beautiful countryside. These are two villages on the southern coast of the peninsula. This is Kyle of LOCHALSH, looking towards the Sky Bridge that was put in 1997. They took the tolls off, I think, in 2004, and it effectively pretty much eliminated ferry traffic here because this was free. This is from Balmacara, looking across the loch to the Isle of Skye back here. And so this is the western side of the parish, and then you get the real contrast. This is the eastern side of the parish, and much more desolate, much different in how it looks. This is Bain Dornog, meaning ragged hill. And these are almost on the eastern boundaries of the parish. And then this mountain, or what they call a Munro, is called the Brindled One. And a Munro is just a mountain that's 3,000 feet or more. And they call it brindled because the stone sticks out and gives it kind of this brindled looking pattern. And LOCHALSH, like Kintail Parish, is kind of known for their mountain ridge walking places. Reverend Downey, he talks a lot about the crops and produce that is farmed and produced there. He talked that mainly the farmers raise the crops to feed themselves and their livestock. Not too much is exported. The crops grown were oats, barley, potatoes, turnips, peas, all kinds of legumes. The potato became really important, and it was introduced about 1750, but this Spaniards had brought it over to the European continent from Peru much earlier, but didn't really get going until like the 1750s. And it was, you know, the wonder food. It was inexpensive. It was, it grew really well in poor soil, and it was very nutritious, and it, you know, quickly became a staple in the Highlands and other places as well. And that reliance, you know, became kind of a problem in the mid 1800s with the potato famine. James Hogg, he was a Scottish writer and poet, and he did some traveling around the Highlands, and he was in Lochs. And in his writings, he stated that only about 3% of the acreage was under tillage, and that was about 1,450 acres. He was a tremendous sheep farm proponent. So you know, his estimate could have been a means to a desired end. So, you know, I don't know how accurate that is, but that's what he mentioned. But, you know, if we think back on those maps, you know, there's only those areas that surround, you know, the coast and the lochs that were under tillage. He doesn't, Reverend Downey didn't go into great deal of describing how farming was done, but in writings about the Western Highlands and what was going on there in terms of farming, it can be assumed that it was run rig farming, which is a very labor intensive, very inefficient way to do things, but the way things had been done for kind of a long time. Run rig farming is composed of runs, which is where your, you know, where your pastures are, and then a set of rigs, or what they call strips or lazy beds, and you can see them up here. Those beds or strips, probably multiple families, joined in and, you know, worked cooperatively to do some of the tasks like plowing and planting and at harvest. It's said that they rotated who had what strips on a 6 to 7 year basis, so that folks, you know, wouldn't be stuck with one type of land if it was good or bad or whatnot. And they tried to eliminate any kind of resentments that folks might feel. The heriter at the time, Francis Mackenzie, he was very hesitant to change how the farming was done. He to his own disadvantage, but he was more of a supporter of this being done. In addition, you know, plowing is an essential activity when you farm. He didn't outright say how the plowing was done, whether it was done by hand or whether they used horses or cattle or whatnot. But there was a survey of cattle and livestock in the year before the statistical account was written, and LOCHALSH had 275 horses, which, you know, is a good number. And they most likely the native Highland ponies, they were called Garans. And, you know, so I think that we can surmise that with 275 horses, that they probably used them to plow. And it was probably with a crude wooden plow, so nothing too advanced, but it would cut the time needed to turn over these fields. And I forgot to mention, but there was an estimate that it would take one man 1 month with a spade, you know, by hand, to turn over 1 acre of land. So using a plow, you're going to cut that time, you know, in half, although the labor needed to hook the horses up and actually run the plow it took some labor. So they would harness 2 to 4 ponies together, And then there would be 3 men needed. One would be the driver that held the handles to the plow. There'd be a gentleman in the front that would be driving the horses forward. And then there'd be a gentleman at the back behind the driver that would be using a spade to turn over anything that the plow missed. So I'm hoping that they did utilize those horses. This slide is talking, again, it shows, highlights that survey that was done in 1793, the year before the submission was completed. And, you know, LOCHALSH was a pastoral economy, and at the heart of that was cattle. And the farmer, you know, lived and paid his rent to the heriter through cattle, raising of cattle, and spent most of his time doing that. There were 2.5 times the number of cattle than people in the parish. They were probably this, you know, Celtic shorthorn cattle that were, you know, really hardy. And the story goes that they were named Kylo because when they were swimming cattle from Skye across a very narrow strait there, and in Gaelic it's called a Kyle, so they therefore called them Kylo. I think, you know, we could take that with a grain of salt, I'm not quite sure. So about 400 cattle a year were sold to drovers that came from the south to the markets that were held between April and November. It said that the cattle would be sold for 3 guineas, which I think turns to be £3, 3 shillings. And the Highland drovers, you know, lots has been written about them. People call them an intimidating sight. And again, one of the travel writers that was, you know, went through the Highlands, he described them as great, stalwart, hirsute men, shaggy, uncultured, and wild, who look like bears as they lounge heavily along. You know, the description just talks about their physical appearance, but these men were skilled, really skilled in, you know, navigating the terrain, living in the wild. You know, they had to take these cattle through tracks, you know, sometimes that weren't there or established, and across rivers and, you know, all kinds of things. They also knew cattle, knew how to take care of them because they were important. They were expensive, you know, that's how they made money. A lot of the skilled cattle drovers ended up immigrating to America and Australia. And in America, they contributed greatly to cowboy culture here, especially in like Appalachia and the Midwest and Texas, especially. The sheep and goats that are noted in this survey, there were no large sheep farms in LOCHALSH Parish at this time. So it's theorized that these are the, you know, smaller, not as hardy Highland sheep that were there, and they were used for their wool and their meat. The goats were a semi-feral type of animal that was in the Highlands. And they also say that they think that there were twice as many goats as cattle in the Highlands. They used goats for their milk and their meat. The butter and cheese that was exported from LOCHALSH Parish, they exported it in great quantities. They said that it was really fine quality and had excellent flavor. And they suppose that that's because the butter fat content of the cow's milk is about 10%. And then lastly, in terms of other things that come from the from the parish. Reverend Downey notes that there's 63 boats that are employed in fishing, but then he says that there are no fish exported from the parish. So I found that curious, and I did find other writings that did say that there was herring fishing in LOCHALSH at this time. But he also states that kelp product, the alkaline ash that is distilled from the kelp and used in the production of glass and soap, contributes greatly to the valued rent of the parish. So, maybe those boats are used more for kelping than for fishing. But the fish that the fishermen would take most likely, of course, were herring, scythe, which is a small coalfish, lingcod, skate, those kinds of things. I was really surprised not to hear him say anything about salmon, or shellfish for that matter. And then many of the travel writers who explored the Highlands just had nothing but good things to say about Loch Duick. It was considered, one of the most excellent and bountiful fishing stations in the whole of the Highlands. The last part that Reverend Downey starts to talk about at the end when he's talking about farming and produce and crops and whatnot is that they are trying to bring in improvements, agricultural improvements and changes. The first thing that he talks about is an additive of coral and shell sands to help the alkaline soil. And this was a free product, but it sprung up a new industry, and that was actually delivering that by boat to the shore for the people. It was this additive to the soil was used with other things that they were already using, like kelp or actual manures. I guess the most significant improvement and change would be the enclosures, fencing and putting up barriers. And I guess this was spurred because there's a lot of writings about cows dying over the winter, due to not being pastured August to November, that there was little straw or hay set aside for them. And, they just didn't have enough food for the cattle. And then that would be compounded by not having enough for the horses and the sheep and the goats. So they began a practice of putting up, fencing or barriers, on ground so that they could grow at that time, grasses or artificial grasses like clover and rye. And then they would alternate them annually with hay and barley, so that the cattle could graze in this enclosure. They wouldn't have to worry about them, and then they wouldn't be tromping on other fields, that had new growth or had crops on them. He also said that it would benefit them because the cattle could pasture at night, and then there wouldn't be the labor done to, bring them back and forth into a barn or whatnot. Reverend Downey goes on to talk about that, these improvements, these changes in how things are done were normally done first by the taxmen or the heritors on the heritors' land themselves to kind of, be an example and give, see how great this is going to be and see how it changes things and makes your life easier and the yields of your crop better and all that kind of thing. But then he also goes on to say that there are barriers, to folks implementing these changes. And, one is money to buy new tools or to employ new methods. But he said the most significant barrier was actually the feelings of the people, the actual farmers, who said, the way we've done it, always the way we've done it is good enough. We've done it this way. We're going to continue to do it this way. You can't change our mind, kind of thing. So even though some of these changes were made gradually, a couple of decades go by, it really didn't make a difference significantly, because these improvements were also driven by the fact that the owners of the land, the heritors, they needed to increase their incomes, what they were getting from their investment in these lands, and they believed that with higher yields, they could be getting more money, more effective land management. They truly believed that there would be more employment for the people. But like I said, even if they could gradually get rid of run rig, which they felt was so inefficient, and improve these farms and how these farms were managed, it didn't really postpone the eventual sheep farms. And the new heritor that purchased LOCHALSH Parish in 1801, he placed an ad in 1811 and 1812 for almost the whole of LOCHALSH and Kintail, for sheep farms. And he just extolled the virtues of the land, and how perfectly suited it was for sheep walks. And, they got double and triple, in some cases, rents for their land from sheep. Bruce pointed out, and I think it is really, really good, is in this ad, it mentions the names of these small farms and villages where some of our folks were from, and it just helps put places and what was going on together. And for Catherine and I, this no knock, I guess is how it's pronounced, is really helpful, because that connected specifically for me and my 4 times great grandfather. Had no idea where he was in LOCHALSH, and because this name popped up and it matched a marriage certificate, so it was really really helpful. I am going to turn it over to Bruce, and Bruce is going to talk about the population and some of the reasons that it grew. So take it away. Whoops, you're muted. You're muted.
There you go.
There we go.
Kathy, that's great. We can talk now about the population. It's a very interesting aspect of the parish, and I suppose the net answer will be that what we're seeing is a growth to the level of overpopulation. Now, when you look at these numbers here, you can see that the 1755 census that we've seen in other talks like this, the number in the parish was about 600 and something, and the number of fighting men was 122. But if you come on, really it's only like a generation and a half to the time that he's writing this account. You see that already you've got more than double the population that was there only a generation and a half ago. You've got 279 families, I want you to remember that. And you've got the number of fighting men, nearly double what were there in 1755. So, it's really like an amazing thing that this population has grown so dramatically over this short time. How could that be? And it's no wonder that the land, which we know is wet and not very fertile because of the wetness, is so under pressure, and there's pressure to do things. Thanks, Kathy.
Okay.
So he explains, he says that this is really a dramatic thing, but the extraordinary thing is that there have been several explanations of why the population should have gone down in this period, not gone up. And part of that was that anyone who supported Jacobites in the Culloden, you know, the uprising in 1745 and 46, was rounded up summarily. Some were shot on that day, and afterwards they were shot. Some were just rounded up from long distance away from the battlefield and sent to prisons. And many were took the opportunity to get a remission of their prison sentence by taking the opportunity to join the army and go to hellholes like Barbados and other places in the Caribbean. So there's a reason that people are starting to get thinking about going overseas. And we had in the 1770s quite a large number of people leaving this parish and others, but you know, this parish in particular. Skye as well, people left to go to particularly the Carolinas in the 1770s. And this was a very interesting period of outward migration, in that the people who were leaving were the prosperous people. They were people who were not being forced off their land by poverty, but more seeing the opportunities that were arising, particularly in the valley of the Cape Fear River, which is in the Carolinas. And there you have so many Gaelic-speaking Scots that had said that the slaves on their plantations spoke Gaelic, not English. You know, it's quite an interesting aspect of life in the 1770s. And of course, this is where we get the McLennan County in Texas comes from a family that went from Skye, in this case, to first to the Carolinas and then round to Florida and then further on to Texas and settled at near what's now Waco. Waco is the capital of McLennan County, Texas. So this is a sort of pattern that we know from our earlier talk about migration. And you've got to remember that these are people who were going of their own choice. They were usually people with some financial reasonable circumstances. They could pay their own fares. They were taxmen and you know, senior tenants that were doing the migrating and not being pushed out by any landlords, or even for that matter, sheep runs. Of course, this migration was also mirrored by the numbers that went to Nova Scotia, some to Pictou and some to other parts of the Maritimes. So you've got quite a lot of migration happening in this time, all cut off really by the rebellion by the 13 colonies in North America. And that was put an end to that. During this time, the Lairds were worried that they were losing so many people that they had really tried to stop the people migrating, not the other way around that you might have thought was the norm. So they more saw the positive side of it, the migrating. He felt that there were some people who were so attached to their land that some might prefer to stay on. And in fact, many of the families in LOCHALSH tended to pass on the same site, piece of land from one generation to the next. So you have quite a pattern there of settled life, not like we saw in Urry, where the numbers were more like coming in and out. The second thing that goes against this idea that there should have been an increase in population is that quite a number of people were recruited for the overseas wars, you know, the Napoleonic Wars and the American Revolution and so on, and various campaigns in the Caribbean were, in fact, quite a lot of people. Mackenzie, the Laird of this parish, was very influential in the military affairs, and of course had his own 78th Regiment of Foot, known as the Seaforth Highlanders. And in one case, he was able to recruit just in 2 days, 40 new recruits for his regiment. So you can see that these are factors that should have decrease the population, not increase the population. So how does it come about? Well, anybody got any suggestions? Let's turn your mic on if you've got a suggestion. Come on, why did the population go up? A few suggestions here.
Well, judging on my introduction to genealogy, if one thing has impressed me, it's the size of families. Numbers of children born by the women is just astonishing. So if people weren't flowing into this particular region, it certainly suggests that family sizes were quite large.
No television, Donald, is that what you're saying?
They did have curling though.
And then may have been healthier,
What's that?
may have been healthier,
Healthy.
not as many deaths.
Yeah, that's a good point you raised, Barbara. There'd been the scourge of the Highlands had been smallpox, and many were inoculating, particularly in this parish. They were more amenable to being inoculated than they were in the other parish that we saw last meeting, Urry. And of course, the potato is a big factor. Come on, you should have said the potato, you people. Potato, it's answered to most problems. Potato was, such a godsend, and it had only been introduced, you remember, in the generation and a half before this account was written. And so people were healthier. They didn't suffer quite so much through the long winters with no food to eat and, just generally healthier. So the potato was really a godsend, and you could see it reflected in the population numbers. Yeah, big thing, the potato. So a healthier life, that's part of the story there. Yeah.
So you're saying their life expectancy was longer, Bruce?
Yeah, and infants, particularly, children were able to survive through the childhood. It's a big thing. Yeah, so that was, they were factors in keeping the population up. That's quite good. You can see that this parish has quite a lot of people by comparison with some of the others. For McLennans, I mean, the number of McLennans in this parish is almost equal to some of the other larger parishes. So we'll see that in a minute when we look at click onto it, Kathy. Yeah. So here are all the parishes, the big ones we know well, the four big ones there. And then the next one down is LOCHALSH, this one we're talking about today. In that early decade of the first decade of the 1800s, we've got over 5% of the total McLennans that we've got recorded, and we've got better records than anybody else. Is in the top bunch there, 5th place. Yeah, so between them, these parishes here, yeah, it's just high. It's a significant parish to us, and I think particularly because of the numbers that migrated out of there. But we're now starting to see, of course, the reasons why this overpopulation, poor agricultural prospects, why that's so. This is giving us a reason long before there were evictions due to sheep runs. Okay, back to you, Kathy.
Okay. Reverend Downey characterized the inhabitants of LOCHALSH in terms of this quote: "The people from their infancy, principally employed in the attending of cattle, are generally disposed to be idle, though able-bodied, continue at hard work with reluctance." And when I read this first part, when he was talking about their occupations and whatnot, I thought, wow, this appears to me that he thinks that they're lazy. And, while the tending of cattle is that seems like their main occupation, they have so many more tasks that have to be done, through the changing of the seasons, to feed their families, to feed the livestock, to do jobs that aren't for the heriter, for the taxman. So, while those different tasks wouldn't necessarily be called an occupation because they wouldn't be earning income from that work. So, looking at what they were doing. So like during the summer, many times the whole family would be involved in following the cattle herd up into the hills and the mountains. And, the men would be guarding the cattle and making sure that they didn't wander off. The women would be, milking the cows, making butter, cooking, watching children, that kind of thing. Those were extensive things to do. They also would spin wool and knit while they were there. If they had to go farther afield into the hills and mountains, they would have to stay over, and they had temporary buildings in the hills called sheilings. When farming, required just a tremendous amount of work, from all different aspects. The soil really had to be prepared. They had to wait for the ground to be thawed. They had to dig ditches and make sure the drainage of that soil was working correctly. They had to amend those soils, with the coral sands and shell sands that we're talking about, and kelp and manures. And they had to plow it, either by hand or using horses and cattle. They, then had to let the land rest once it was manured, and then they actually had to rake it and then plant it in the spring. So there was lots to do and very labor intensive. He also mentions, in terms of occupations, he goes back to during the summer before the harvest, that these folks were out fishing. And, again, I would hypothesize that he's probably maybe talking about kelping. And kelping is also a very time-consuming, labor-intensive job. And again, the families could be roped into doing certain parts of that. Parts of that would be, you would have to stand in, knee-deep water that's cold for hours, grabbing kelp and then bringing it up to the beach and then making its way to a fire pit so that it would be reduced. And he talks about, in terms of fishing and whatnot, he talks about that, they have opportunities, that they're situated in an advantageous place because they're so near the sea, and there's so many fish and resources there. But he said that it just wasn't working specifically because of a salt tax. Because if they did bring in as much fish as they possibly could, salt was very expensive. So they only fished and brought back what they had enough salt to cure the fish with. So he was proposing that the salt tax was unfair, and that needed to open things up so that folks could not only have enough salt to cure for their own consumption, but that they could then cure fish to be exported to, like, Ireland, into the West Indies. Reverend Downey was always looking for a way to bring in other industry to supplement these people, their incomes. He did get his wish. After this statistical account was published, they did get rid of that tax. He also starts to talk about women and women's work. He specifically calls out the women in particular as being ignorant of the domestic arts, and that they contribute little to the support of their families. So again, when reading that, I got kind of excited and a little upset that he was characterizing that way, because I was thinking about all the domestic tasks that women at this time would have been charged with, and that would have been, meal preparation and cooking and child rearing and spinning and actually making the cloth, and making the clothes and the bedding and socks, knitting socks, and then their work that they had to do for the farming or the dairying, so I look at all that and I think, well, those are all very much in support of the family. I think maybe his interpretation of that was just that, they didn't earn an income from what they did. Many travel writers, that were going through the Highlands during the 1767 to the 1790s really noticed, and they wrote about that they noticed in the Highlands that women were doing non-traditional women's work. And there was a big piece on it, as typical in the Highlands, women spun wool, to make cloth, to make bedding and clothes. And spinning was normally done with a spindle and a distaff. And a distaff is just like a big wooden fork. That's what this looks like. And they talk about it being, very portable, and that they would take this wherever they went. If their hands would be free, they could be walking to and from, carrying goods to one place to another or whatnot. And their hands would be free and they could do this as they walked along. And one gentleman, James Robertson, wrote, quote, "Scots women never parted with their distaff and used it to carry it everywhere. They were naturally industrious. Wherever they go, they carry that, and their method of spinning on the road while they trudged along with a heavy burden." And the other thing I thought interesting is the word spinster. It comes from this old chore. Some light was shown, some additional light was shown on occupations that were held by McLennans. And this was specifically in the 1798 register of men that could bear arms. And the 5 that they noted were servant, tenant, meaning farmer or livestock, weaver, resident, and mason. And then looking at the clan statistics for the decade 1800 to 1810, they noted the top 5 were tenant, farmer, livestock, fisherman, mason, tailor, and sawyer, which is somebody that cuts lumber. In LOCHALSH Parish, there wasn't a formalized forestry program until the mid 1800s. Reverend Downey goes on to talk more that some habits of industries were coming to bear. He really kept thinking, there's so much wool available here, there we could manufacture stockings, something to get other opportunities in place, because he was so concerned that the population, if it doubled again, that this parish couldn't support itself, and that these people would be at subsistence level, and then be very, very open to the pull of immigration. So in the beginning of his account, he he makes some comments about them being idle and lazy, but he truly redeems himself at the end of his statistical account, I think. And he says, quote, "The people are the hardiest of subjects, with a simple manner and an obedience to the laws of home, are proud, have a personal strength and vigor of mind." So he comes back from his earlier comments. He did briefly mention the poor. There were about 35 folks on the poor roll. He mentions that collections for the poor were done, at the church, and on an average of about £7 was collected. And then it would be reviewed, the needs would be reviewed, and the money distributed after they would do it at a Kirk session, which usually was the minister, landowners or, men of stature kind of thing would make the decisions on how it would get dispersed. He talks about the housing that housing is generally, examples of traditional Western Highlands. They use the materials that were available: stones, turf, thatch for the roofs, wood beams for the framing underneath. This is a much later picture, and there are windows, and there generally weren't windows and generally not chimneys. This is a little bit better picture. In the one previous, that building had been limed washed, and they didn't tend to do that until much later on. A couple of things to note here. This is typical of one of the common smaller boats called a lapstrake that they used. And this is a sledge, and this would be either pulled by people or they could harness it to a horse or a cow. There is a wheel here, but these were usually dragged because the tracks or the trails that folks were on just it was wet, and it just wasn't really didn't really work well with anything that was wheeled. I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce, and he is going to talk about fuels and transportation of people and goods. You're muted.
Thanks, Kathy.
You're
Yes,
welcome.
luckily there was some peat. Of course, this is the other side of having having a wet, boggy place that has things coming down from hills. It creates mossy areas that, the decomposed plant matter that creates the peat mosses, as they call them, for burning in their homes. And the thing that Kathy's discovered that perhaps puts it in perspective for this particular meeting is that a typical household would burn 15,000 peat pieces, and they're like about, so big each, every year. And of course, we had no matches, so you didn't turn them off and turn them on again when you needed. You just had to keep it burning all day and night in your black house, those sort of houses that Kathy's just, or more basic even than those she's shown us just now. And you'd be a fire in the middle of the room typically, and there would be no chimney, so that the smoke would filter out through the thatch and create quite a smoky environment inside, as we heard in the Harris presentation. And people would smell of smoke, and their clothes would be full of smoke smell, and the fire would just keep burning and would be, keep them warm as well as cooking. It'd be a chain hanging down usually over the fire, so you could have your pot there with your gruel heating up in it. And that would be your sort of 3 meals a day from the grains. It's very interesting, isn't it, that grain had to be imported into this parish because of the nature of the topography, the wetness and so on made it difficult to grow grains, and quite a significant amount had to be imported from other parts, like the east of the Highlands, or even from the central belt, between near Edinburgh. So the fuel they burnt, they were fortunately able to get quite a lot of peat, although it was quite laborious to collect the peat. As we've seen previously, they used these sorts of spades that you see on the right-hand side. They would first cut them, and they'd be very wet, so they'd just leave them out there for some time to dry out in the fields where they'd been cut, and then go back later and bring them, then carry them, like you see being done here with creels, carry them either in the creels like that on their backs, or on the sides of horses back to their homes, where they'd be stacked up again, and in such a way they weren't too close together. They stacked them so this breeze can get through and they can be dried out, ready to be burnt. Often the carrying back of the peats was something that children and women did during the months that the men were away fishing. Next slide, Kathy. So there's a picture of the horses with creels on their sides, and that perhaps is down by a waterside. I'm not sure where that is, but you know, that's a way of carrying kelp around too sometimes, using their ponies. And then you have these types of boats. You know, of course, there were very few roads in this parish at this time. And so the sea was really the highway that they used for most activities. And the sea, they have these little tiny things here that were covered in a hide of an animal, and that had that little wooden frame. Must have been quite hard to keep going in a straight line, I would have thought, with with a round hull like that. But that's because of the hide being used to cover it, called a curragh. And then they also made smaller boats like the ones you see on the right-hand side here, that were more conventional, you know, typical lap timbers that force themselves together when they get wet, so making them even more waterproof. And they would use those for fishing as well. Yeah, and they'd travel, you know, like people would go quite often across to Glen Shiel, for example, across the LOCHALSH, the two words, to see their pals or attend an event or something on the other side of the loch. Next slide, Kathy. So this is a really interesting map that we found for this particular talk, and it really has quite had quite an impact on the way we thought about this. Following the Jacobite risings in the early 1700s, 15 and 19, that when the castle at Eilean Donan was wrecked by the British Navy, and the church at Kintail was also bombed, they built these roads that are in red here. Wade was the fellow responsible, the army officer in charge of this project. And the red roads were created as a sort of network to move troops around quickly to control the rebellious Highlanders. And then when he died, the job was taken over by his deputy, Caulfield, and the dotted lines, the black dotted lines, are the roads that he built. But the interesting thing is that LOCHALSH is not even on one of these roads. You can see that the road that Kathy will point out now goes across from Fort Augustus to Glenelg. It doesn't go anywhere near LOCHALSH. It goes along the southern side of the LOCHALSH and directly to Glenelg. And why is that? Because the narrowest kyle or water between the mainland and Skye is there at Glenelg. And I've done that little ferry trip. It's quite short across from Glenelg to Skye, near Armidale and Skye. It's and so the road they took to get to Skye was the more direct route across this narrower kyle or waterway, narrow strait between the mainland and the big island of Skye. And it went to Glenelg, and they had a barracks there at Glenelg. You can see the picture on the left here of the military barracks, which is where all the soldiers were stationed who were trying to keep the wild Highlanders under control, keep them under the thumb. And that's was part of this road building and control operation that they had with the roads. And yet, LOCHALSH was not any sort of a centre of connecting roads, let's say, not till quite a while later, and let alone when the railways, you know, it would be nearly another century before the railway turned up at LOCHALSH. Thanks, Kathy.
Reverend Downey also talked about briefly about the health and the diet of the folks. I don't have a slide to match that, but he noted that the inhabitants were healthy and for the most part lived to a considerable age. You know, he said that they, you know, suffered from what he called nervous fevers or distempers. Typhus was a big problem and prevalent in the, you know, mid 18th century. And like Bruce mentioned, you know, smallpox was really a problem, but they were amenable to inoculations, and it really, really helped. The diet, again, LOCHALSH Parish, their diet was, pretty good and pretty diverse. The central part of the diet was what they called broses, made from barley and oats. They'd add potatoes and beans and peas. And then, you had your salted meats and you had fish. And so, I think that's why people were living longer, and maybe the population was growing at such a rate because they had a pretty good diet. In hard times, if the harvest wasn't so great, or the food stores were getting low, sometimes they would bleed cattle and mix blood into their porridge. He does talk about the education and language, and education was kind of near and dear to Reverend Downey's heart. He was, pretty liberal minded, and he did a lot. There were lots of letters written back and forth to different kinds of societies. So he had a real interest in education. There was a parochial school near the church in Kirkton. The Society in Scotland for propagating Christian knowledge also had a school. They had established one in 1732. Some of the writings say that they sometimes didn't have teachers, and teachers tended to be ministers or clergymen, and that they didn't speak Gaelic which was not very helpful. There was a real bent with these the Society in Scotland schools to teach in English and only in English, and making them learn rote. But they found out later on that while they could repeat in English, they didn't know what they were saying. They didn't, and they certainly couldn't understand the Bible and Bible stories. They could just repeat the words. Reverend Downey, he emphasized in a letter written to the Society for the Education of the Poor in the Highlands that it's really difficult to provide education to the inhabitants because they're scattered throughout this peninsula, and it's made more difficult by distance and travel. They had to cross rivers and hills and walk a long ways. So he felt that there are no more than about 20 students out of a population of 1,000 to 2,000. He writes that most can speak Gaelic, but most can't read it. And then there was a big push to use Gaelic and English with English translations, so that they would begin to learn English. I think that's that. The minister of the parish, again, is Reverend Alexander Downey. He was new to this ministry, but he was very familiar with the life of a minister because his father was one. So he was born in 1765 in Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis. He's the son of Reverend John D. Downey and Charlotte Mackenzie. Reverend John D. Downey was a minister in Stornoway, in Gairloch, and in Uri.
And that was the minister we dealt with in the last meeting, you remember? This
Yes,
is the son of
yes.
the previous meeting.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that he got, more of the ropes from his dad, because they weren't that far away from one another.
Yeah.
So, like Bruce said, he was made chaplain to the 1st Battalion of the Foot, the 78th Highlanders, and his father was also a chaplain to the 78th Seafort Highlanders. He married a Janet McKinnon from the Isle of Skye in 1795, and they had 7 children. One of his sons also joined the ministry. His name was Charles Downey. He was a minister in, is it Compton and Strathgrave, Garth? A minister from Alness, one of the parishes that we heard about a couple months ago, a Reverend Donald Sage, he commented on Reverend Downey as, quote, a man of wealth and gentlemanly manners, a princely landlord, an extensive sheep farmer, a good shot, but he was a wretched preacher. His sermons were literal transcripts from Blair. He read these in English and then translated them to the purest and most elegant Gaelic. So it seems like Reverend Downey might have been a little bit of a plagiarist and was taking sermons that this gentleman, Hugh Blair, who was a Scottish minister and considered one of the great Christian theorists on Christian morality. And he was also a big part of the Scottish Enlightenment. So was that. He was, like I said before, Reverend Downey was liberal-minded and a really big supporter of the Gaelic School Society. He died in the parish in 1820 in Kirkton, and this is a picture of his headstone. He and his wife are buried there in that churchyard. And we really wanted to call out Tina Glenn Riddell for all her work with taking headstone pictures and transcriptions, and she does a great job. The church in Kirkton, they believe that there's been a place of worship on this site since the Celtic period, when there was a small monastery established there in 1720 AD. And they believe it was founded by, his name is Comgan, and he was the son of King Kelly of Leinster, Ireland. He's the brother of Saint Kentigern and the uncle to Saint Filian. So he inherited his father's kingdom, but for his religious beliefs, he, his sister, and her sons, and a couple of other religious men, they were exiled, and they made their way over and they settled in LOCHALSH in Western Ross. In the 15th century, it said that there was a place of worship actually erected, and then it was dedicated to Saint Comgan, and he's the patron saint of LOCHALSH. The structure, they say, subsequently burned down, and that kind of coincides with a story about a grave that is in this graveyard of a late medieval knight, and there's a story that goes behind that. A traditional church was built in 1641. There's interesting things that can be found in the MacLennan database. In the notes section, you can search by place name, and this came up. And in this note, there was a writing by a Reverend Ennis Sage in 1727 about this church and the parishioners. And he was reporting to the presbytery that, you know, the people were not attending church, and the church building was a wreck, basically, and in really poor shape. And furthermore, you know, they didn't do anything about giving him a manse or a glebe or, you know, anything like that. So he took it upon himself to identify 4 acres in nearby Ard Hill and for his manse and his office and his garden. But the current tenant happened to be an Alexander McLennan, and so they tried to order him to leave. Well, I don't think that worked out very well, because 4 years later in 1731, Another minister, Reverend Donald McLeod, petitioned the presbytery and said, you know what, things were bad then, they're even worse now. The church is just in total disrepair. The people aren't coming. They're not even, showing that they have an interest in listening to the gospel. And furthermore, Alexander McLennan and some others are still on that 4 acres. And, I want the assistance of the sheriff of Ross to, remove him. So the next things that happen is they did a couple of, sprucing up in 1793, but the building was still really terrible. So the new heritor, that's Sir Hugh Innes, he tore it down in 1803 and opened it back up in 1807. And that's the building that you see here. When he opened it up, he tried to recoup some of the money that was spent by charging seat rents. And he had these men stationed in the front with sticks, trying to get them to pay their seat rents. And it didn't last very long. Reverend Downey states that all the people belong to the Church of Scotland, which is Presbyterian, except for 62 Roman Catholics, and that's about 4%. And they would have been attending the church over Loch Long there in Dorney. And it wasn't until 1838 that they built a government church in Ploughton. People had to walk or, travel by boat many miles to attend church services. The church, again, it still stands. The kirkyard, there are lots of McLennans in this kirkyard. And whoops. Here's a few of them. And again, thanks to Tina Glenn Riddell for these photos. The first family is William and Mary Campbell McLennan, and William's parents were Alexander and Rebecca Murchison McLennan. He was a agricultural laborer and farmer, and William and Mary had 1 daughter and 5 sons, and the daughter is buried here. And this is her headstone here with the anchor, and it's just interesting that they used this symbol of the anchor because, she wasn't a fisherman and she wasn't a sailor. But in looking at the information, it says that when an anchor is used like this, sometimes it means steadfastness in faith and in hope. The heritor of LOCHALSH Parish during when the statistical account was written was Francis Humberston Mackenzie. He was later known as Lord Seaforth. He did not live in the parish much to the consternation of the tenants. He his main residence was Brawhan Castle, which is this is an illustration of that castle, and we heard about it in the Uri presentation. It's near Dingwall. The Brawhan Castle and the estates of the Seaforths or the Mackenzies had been in the family for like four centuries. The rent value of the parish isn't exactly known, but they consider the real value of LOCHALSH Parish to be about £800 sterling a year. And during his 32 years that he was owned LOCHALSH and the greater Seaforth estates, which were, like the Isle of Lewis, Kintail, Dingwall, and whatnot, he was never free from debt. He always had financial problems, and they make mention that, he was pretty personally extravagant and was always making improvements to his own land and places of residence. But he also had a kinder side because he didn't want to make changes to how things were done in, LOCHALSH Parish for certain, and move people around and change their way of life. And so that was to his financial detriment. He was born in 1754 in Kintail. He was the great grandson of Kenneth Mackenzie, who was the 6th Earl of Seaforth. As a child, he contracted scarlet fever and he lost his ability to hear and basically to speak. So communications with him were basically some kind of sign language and written communications. He, by all accounts, was a very accomplished and intelligent and considerate and influential man, but they do say that he was very strong-willed and could be very cranky. After the death of his brother in 1783, he inherited this role as the last male heir of the Earls of Seaforth and became the chief of the Clan Mackenzie. He was a member of Parliament a couple of times. He was a fellow in the Royal Society. He was a fellow in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was a Highland romanticist. He had strong feelings about genealogy and the clan and what the Highlands meant. And he was a friend of Sir Walter Scott, the novelist, who wrote Lady of the Lake and Rob Roy. In the 1800s, he became the governor of Barbados for 6 years, and there were a lot of Scots in the West Indies and Guyana, the British colony there. And, lots of people went from the 1750s to the 1800s, to kind of make their mark and make money and then come home and with that money and invest it in Scotland. He held high offices also in Guyana. While he was there, he didn't use his last name, Mackenzie. He used Seaforth, and he had an illegitimate daughter there, and there are still descendants that use that name, Seaforth. And it's said that he used that name because there is a Mackenzie called the Brahon Seer in the early 1700s that made all these predictions about what would happen to the Mackenzies. And, one of the, they were generally not good predictions. They were bad predictions. So people hypothesize that that's why he used the name Seaforth. While he was there as a governor of Barbados, he played a large part in reforming slavery there. He changed the laws regarding and put a prohibition on killing of slaves, and he eased discrimination of free Black people, even though he himself owned slaves and had plantations. This, you might imagine, didn't make him, it didn't make the other fellow planters and the Scots and the Dutch very happy. They insulted him. They would call him names. There would be things in the paper written about him. So he ended up resigning in 1808 and came home. He married Mary Proby. She was a daughter of Reverend Proby, who was a high member in the church. And they had 10 children, 4 sons and 6 daughters. Like Bruce had talked about, he did raise battalions for the Army. He was very proud of that. That was near and dear to him. He advertised LOCHALSH for sale in 1798 and 1799. The LOCHALSH folks were really, really unhappy and said they would pay off all his debts if he would just come home and live in the parish. He didn't take him up on that offer. In 1801, Hugh Innes purchased LOCHALSH for £38,000. Hugh Innes had made his money in the cotton trade in America because he had relatives there. And it said that Lord Seaforth regretted selling up until his death. And he said, quote, "They were the flower of the Highlands, and the ancestors had paid for them in blood and treasure." He died in 1815. He's buried in Fortress Cathedral in Inverness. And unfortunately, he had a sad life. All of his sons died before him. So the title did die out with him. And that was one of the predictions by the Brahman seer, was that the line would die out and the last heir would be deaf and dumb. And it just so happened that he wasn't dumb, but the case that he was deaf. That leads us to the Clan Mackenzie. LOCHALSH parish and the surrounding parishes are closely associated with the Clan Mackenzie. It's a powerful clan, was a powerful clan in the Highlands. They were constantly feuding with the MacDonalds of the Isles, the MacLloyds, the Monroes, the MacDonalds of Glengarry, and they were mostly victorious and took over their lands. So he who has the most land wins. Our McLennans and the McRaes, really close association, and we were there to defend their western stronghold at Ely and Donan. It is said, the fact that there is a close association with the McLennans and the McRaes, it makes sense because in Kintail, the McLennans were there from the 15th century and the McRaes from the 13th. So, we were there. So it's no doubt that they would mix it up. Anyway, both of the clan shields, share, I'm going to try to pronounce this. I think it's Caber Fouet, or the stag antlers. And the stag antlers are also the symbol for Rossshire.
Copperfee.
Oh, thank you. So Copperfee.
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 I'm sure it's Copperfee, as in F-E-Y. Copperfee is how it's pronounced.
Okay.
It's also the war cry of one of the one of the army divisions, but I can't remember which one. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, thank you.
The hill, Kathy.
Oh, the hill, yes. So this will, so this is the Clan Mackenzie crest, and you see the burning hill in the background, and this will make sense in just a moment. It's like the fire beacons on the hill. This is a little bit about McLennans in the parish. Like Bruce mentioned, I was pretty excited because I have ancestors that were from LOCHALSH, as well as Catherine McLennan Bradbury also, who's on the call also, and we are cousins. And specifically our 4 times great-grandfather, Alexander John McLennan and Mary McRae, he was married 3 times and he had 14 children, but right now we're just talking about the 5 sons. So he had 5 sons, and of those 5 sons, both Catherine's and my 3 times great-grandfather, both Donald McLennan and Finlay McLennan, they immigrated to Ontario, Canada at different times, but they both ended up there. The 3 sons remained lots of intermarrying with Mackenzies, McRaes, and other McLennan families. And the descendants from this family are now spread out all across the world, from Scotland to New Zealand and Australia, coast to coast in Canada, and then throughout the US. The three sons that remained, John and Duncan, both were in Dirinish on farms. John's family, some remained in LOCHALSH except for their son, or in Compton Parish, except for their son Murdo, who ended up immigrating to New Zealand in 1857. Duncan's family, from what I could see in the records as of 1881, they were still on the farm there. Farmers, and in some places it also indicated that they, were shepherds. The last son, Kenneth, he was on a farm at the end of Loch Long, called Leiter, I guess that's how it's pronounced, up here. And most of his children remained in LOCHALSH, except for a daughter who's said to have immigrated with her husband to Australia. Bruce, do you want to talk about the Grafton folks? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Muted again. Yes, since we have the president of the Grafton.
Yeah, that would be great. Yes.
Briefly mention, I know time's running out, but Sandy McLennan, or Alexander, immigrated in 1837 from LOCHALSH Parish. He was from round beyond Plockton, like to the northeast of Plockton, and he had heard this famous New South Wales preacher come around. He was something of a pusher, let's say. He was a politician, and he fell out with all the other clerics in the whole country, and pushed ahead and told the government they were going to pay for ships and all sorts of wonderful story. Anyway, Alexander was planning to migrate to Nova Scotia when he heard John Dunmore Lang, this preacher, talking about the virtues of New South Wales and how it needed strong Scotsmen with courage and conviction to come and settle the land. And so Alexander took up the challenge with his wife, Mary Matheson, and three sisters came as well. And they had huge families. This Alexander and Mary had 13 children of their own. So it's no wonder they can have their own clan association in Grafton. The system, I'm pressing the button. Next slide, Kathy, thanks.
Okay.
They lived initially up in what's called New England district of New South Wales. That's not the one with, Massachusetts in it. And this fellow and his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, Catherine, got a prize for finding a route for transporting wool and so on down to the coast there at Grafton from the New England. There was a prize to find the route, because until then they had to come way down to the middle of the country to avoid all the mountain range. You can see the dividing range marked there on that map, and they got a prize. It was a very tortuous journey, and it's a great story. You can read about it in our clan histories. We have for these people many pages. One of the people who was in yesterday's meeting had accumulated thousands of pages of documentation about these families, newspaper clippings, certificates, photos, stories about them. And we spent 3 man weeks scanning all these documents, and they're all there in the clan histories on the clan genealogy resources.
And he also mentioned that when they were clearing that route, that it was pretty much rainforest and just totally overgrown and just very slow and, slogged through it. So.
There's a mountain there that's named for one of the cattle, the bullocks that they were taking along with them. They had to kill it to eat it because they were starving. And the mountain is named for this bull that they killed. Next slide, Kathy.
Okay.
There's another story about LOCHALSH diaspora. It's a place a fellow who went on his own as a single man on this ship, the Palmyra, to New Zealand, and he met on board a 15-year-old Mary Dewar, and they later married. And there are many parts of the south of New Zealand named for this couple and their children. And this is just some examples here. Kathy will point them out. The township of McLennan, the McLennan mountain range, the McLennan River is there. Florence Head is named for one of their daughters, and many other places in the south, the very south of New Zealand, is a result of this couple, this fellow who went from, he was from Durnish, you know, that's the place we've heard talked about several times. Thank you.
Okay. Final slides are about a few curiosities found in LOCHALSH Parish. The first is Angel Hill, and this picture was again taken by Tina Glenn Riddell. It's just so beautiful with the mists and the cemetery on top of the hill. And this kind of ties into the Mackenzie crest with the burning fire beacon hill, because the real translation of this Gaelic term, it means fire beacon, and somewhere through the ages it's been mistranslated to Angel Hill. Bruce has in his book, A Guide to McLennan Places Across Scotland, in chapter 6 is a whole write-up about Angel Hill. And it's located up a small hill behind LOCHALSH Parish Church in Kirkton. And the graveyard there is significant. There's McLennans and Mackenzies there. These are a few of the headstones. And again, Tina took these pictures. The first one is Isabel McIntosh and Alexander McLennan. They are farmers, lived in, oh, somebody helped me with this yesterday, but Portnaquote. Okay. So that was where they lived. Isabel McLennan and Kenneth McLennan. He was a sea captain and ship owner. His father was also a fisherman and ship owner. Kenneth's mother, brother, and sisters, they all immigrated to New Zealand in 1871. And then 2 of his uncles and 2 of his aunts immigrated to New South Wales in 1837. So some folks immigrating there. And then these are the last 2 McLennan ones that can be read, is Roderick McLennan and Christina Mackenzie and their daughter Mary and daughters Mary and Kate. They were spinsters, but they lived really long lives. You know, Mary was 80 and Kate was 92. They were crofters. And then the last headstone is Anne McLennan and Murdoch McLennan and their daughter Janet, who married a Donald McRae. They were, it's said that Murdoch was a plowman, a farm servant, and they lived in Avernish near Kirkton. This is the grave of the late medieval knight that we were talking about, the status of the church, and that there was a church burnt down in the 15th century. So this is located in LOCHALSH Parish Churchyard there in Kirkton, and it's said to be from the 1500s. It's a large stone carved effigy of a late medieval knight with a claymore. There are initials in it, an F and an M, but nobody really knows who it is. The story goes that in the early 1500s, there was a fight between the MacLeods of Asant and the Mathesons, and it took place in the swampy area between the actual LOCHALSH and the kirkyard. And the MacLeods had landed at Ardhill, and the Mathesons were defending the area. Lots of fighting went down, and it says that the MacLeods were beaten down and they were retreating, and they took sanctuary in the in the kirk. And it said that Duncan Matheson disregarded the concept of sanctuary and any repercussions that would take place if he did, and he set it afire and burned it down. The thought is that this knight is a high-ranking Matheson, and it's said that one of his kinmen, who was a highly regarded archer, walked up the hills, quarried this stone, and brought it down on his back for him. So that's what they say. And the last curiosity, although this was not in place at the time of the statistical account, Donald Murchison was important to LOCHALSH Parish. Colonel Donald Murchison was a kinsman and factor and military leader to William Mackenzie, the 5th Earl of Seaforth, during the Jacobite risings in 1715 and 1719, and as well as through all that went on through 1726. Again, he was a military leader. He commanded lots of Mackenzies, McLennans, and McRaes in the opposition to government forces during the 1719 to 1726. The Earl of Seaforth's lands were forfeited to the crown in 1719 due to this uprising, and he left and went to France. Colonel Murchison risked his life. He used to dress up as a beggar, and he would continue to gather the rents and then take them over to France and give them to William, the Earl of Seaforth. And his luck ran out, and he was finally caught and put in the Tower of London. And it's said that King George I respected him and admired his loyalty, and he pardoned him, and he gave him a grant, which Donald Murchison then purchased, this larger land grant. And then when William, the Earl of Seaforth, was actually pardoned in 1726, he came home and basically refused to accept that grant and offered Donald Murchison something very small as compensation, and asked Donald Murchison, please forgive me. And Donald Murchison, I guess, is famously known for replying, God may forgive you, but I will not. And he died the year later. He was a really disillusioned man after all that he had done. And so his nephew is the one that started the first monument. It's said that Donald Murchison's mother was Margaret McLennan, that she was the daughter of Alexander McLennan of Morvich in Glenshiel Parish. And that came from a book called In Search for the Clan McLennan by Malcolm Lobin and James McLennan. And it's on the Clan McLennan database site. So his grandnephew put up the monument in 1863, and it was hit by lightning. And then his grandnephew, Kenneth Murchison, in 1928, fixed it and put up a plaque. And the plaque says, Talak Ard, which means land of the hills, to the memory of Donald Murchison, Colonel in the Highland Army, 1715. He successfully defended and faithfully preserved the lands of Kintail and LOCHALSH from 1715 to 1722 for his chief William, the exiled chief of Seaforth. And then the painting to the right was commissioned by his nephew, and who also posed as Donald Murchison in the middle for the artist. And the painting tells the story of the Earl's tenants coming to pay their rents to Donald Murchison while trying to stay out of sight of the redcoats across the loch. So that we're at the end. I hope that you have a better understanding of what everyday life for everyday people in LOCHALSH Parish in the 1790s was all about.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That's so great to have had this opportunity to look in detail at the life of people in the LOCHALSH Parish in the 1790s. And we've learned from you, I think, how different this particular parish was in that, you know, it had such a climate due to being on the west coast, buffeted by gales and winds and rain from the Atlantic. And it was so genuinely different to the others that, you know, grain couldn't grow, there wasn't enough stock feed for the animals, the population was increasing due to potatoes. And we see it setting the groundwork for these people emigrating from this parish to other places. So thank you so much. I'd like you to unmute your microphones and give Kathy a big, warm lot of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Oh, you're welcome.